Hey everyone, and welcome back to Fine Print. This week, we're going to be continuing our APUSH Review Series by talking about Unit 5. 5.2 covers the Manifest Destiny. Manifest Destiny was a belief held by Americans that the U.S. was designed to expand and has a responsibility to spread American teachings across North America. While the South loved the idea because more land meant more slavery, the North resented it. There were many conflicts over Texas during this time period as well. The U.S. was interested in acquiring Texas and Oregon, largely due to the number of pioneers living in these areas. After Mexico gained independence from Spain, they hoped to attract settlers to farm in their land. Stephen F. Austin's dad got a land grant in Texas, and Stephen brought 300 families to Texas. By 1830, Americans outnumbered Mexicans in Texas 3 to 1. Mexico abolished slavery and required immigrants to convert to Roman Catholicism. Americans refused to obey, and Mexico closed Texas to additional American immigrants. However, Americans still came into Texas and ignored these requirements. Santa Anna then becomes dictator of Mexico and attempts to further enforce Mexican laws on Texas, but Sam Houston and other Americans declare Texas to be an independent republic. Santa Anna's army attacks the Alamo and kills Americans, but Sam Houston's army surprise attacked Santa Anna's army and forced him to sign a treaty recognizing the independence of Texas, giving him the threat of death. Mexico refused to recognize Texas's independence because the treaty was signed under this threat. Sam Houston applied for Texas to be annexed into the U.S., but President Jackson refused due to the imbalance it would cause between free and slave states. However, the next president, John Tyler, worked to annex Texas, but the Senate rejected the Treaty of Annexation. There were also conflicts over Maine during this time period. The Aroostook War was a conflict between rival lumbermen on the Maine Canadian border and was resolved with the Webster Ashburton Treaty. The Webster Ashburton Treaty stated that disputed territory between Maine and the Canadian New Brunswick was split between Maine and British Canada, and settled Minnesota's boundary as well. There were also conflicts over Oregon. Oregon was claimed by four countries: Britain, who believed it to be an extension of the Hudson Fur Company; the United States, who believed it to be an extension of their Louisiana Territory; Russia, who believed it to be an extension of Alaska; and Spain. Russia and Spain eventually let go, but America and Britain continued to dispute. Americans claimed that the discovery of the Columbia River, the Lewis Clark expedition to the Pacific coast, and the fur trading post in Oregon with successful American farmers proved that they claimed the land. They also believed that Manifest Destiny required them to acquire Oregon and hoped to gain control over California as well. 5.3 covers the Mexican American War. But first was the election of 1844. Northerners opposed Texas annexation, but Southerners supported it because more land meant more slavery. Van Buren was an anti slavery Democrat, and John C. Calhoun from the South was a pro slavery Democrat. The Democrats then nominate James K. Polk. James K. Polk was committed to Manifest Destiny. He favored Texas annexation, the reoccupation of Oregon, and the acquisition of California. His slogan, 54-40 or fight, was what won him the election against Henry Clay of the Whig Party. Right before John Tyler left the White House, he acquired Texas, leaving Polk with the issue of handling conflict with Mexico. But Polk settled to get the southern half of the Oregon Territory as well. War with Mexico was now imminent. Polk sent his diplomat to persuade Mexico to give up California and Mexico to the United States and agreed that the Texan border was along the Rio Grande. Polk sent his diplomat to persuade Mexico to give up California and Mexico to the United States and agreed that the Texan border was along the Rio Grande. When the diplomat was waiting for Mexico's response, Polk sent Zachary Taylor to move an army into Mexican territory, hoping to instigate them into attacking the Americans so that the blame of starting the war would fall on Mexico. Mexico kills 11 Americans, officially being credited for starting the war. Northern Whigs opposed the war, but in vain. Most of the war was fought in Mexican territory. Kearny's forces took New Mexico, and Fremont took Northern California and established it as a republic, the Bear Flag Republic. Taylor's forces drove the Mexican army out of Texas, and Scott captured Mexico City in 1847. In the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the United States took possession of California and New Mexico, the Mexican succession, and the United States paid $15 million. Mexico then recognized the Rio Grande as the southern border of Texas, which the Whigs opposed because it seemed to advance slavery, but the Southern Democrats also opposed it because they wanted all of Mexico. The Wilmot Proviso was a plan by David Wilmot that a bill be amended to forbid any of the newly acquired territories from slavery, but was defeated in Senate. The Northerners believed that the war was solely a Southern effort to increase slavery, as Proviso had seen the early beginnings of the Civil War. Manifest destiny to the South continued during this time period. Southerners were dissatisfied from the territory acquired from the Mexican War and hoped to acquire more. In the Austin Manifesto, Polk offered to purchase Cuba from Spain for 100 million. Spain refuses, so Southern adventurers lead small expeditions to take Cuba through force, but were crushed. The next president, Franklin Pierce, adopts pro-Southern policies and sends American diplomats to Austin to negotiate Cuba with Spain, but the plan was leaked and revoked by anti-slavery members of Congress. In the Walker expedition, Walker unsuccessfully tried to take Baja California, or Southern California, in 1853. He takes Nicaragua in 1855 and gains some recognition, but was collapsed by Central American countries and executed by Honduran authorities. In the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty, neither Britain nor America would attempt to take any future canal route in Central America. In the Gadsden Purchase, Franklin Pierce succeeded in adding a strip of land in Southwest America for a railroad, and Mexico agreed to sell this semi-desert land to the United States for 10 million. Americans also began to migrate to the newly acquired Oregon and California. There were many frontiers that opened during this time period, notably the fur traders' frontier, who were the earliest settlers in the West who provided a lot of information about frontier maps and conditions to later settlers. Overland trails were pioneers who had followed the river valleys through the Great Plains to reach the territories. However, there were fears of Native American attacks, disease, and depression. After the California Gold Rush, there were increased migrations to the west. Thousands settled in the western mountains, and mining camps and towns were temporarily sprouted. California's population soared from 14K to 380K, and one-third of these miners were Chinese. Next was the farming frontier. Most pioneer families moved west to begin farming and families, and the government made land purchase easier and cheaper. The urban frontier also grew during this time period. Western cities rose and attracted business owners. Industrialization spread rapidly through the Northeast. New factories rose, and the telegraph by Morse and the railroad allowed increased communication and transportation in the country. Railroads replaced canals for transportation, and capitalism spurred through the buying of stocks of railroad companies. Cheap and fast transport promoted Western agriculture and gave the North an advantage in the future Civil War. The growth of manufactured goods and products from the North and agriculture products from the South and West increased American imports and exports. Shipping firms encouraged trade and travel across the Atlantic. The demand for whale oil as a light source caused a whaling boom. Improvements in ship design allowed increased immigration to California and faster transport inside America. Steamships had more space and lowered costs, and the United States sent Matthew Perry to open Japan to foreign trade, which had been following an isolationist policy and pressures Japan to open. U.S. vessels then occupied Japanese ports to take coal through a treaty. 5.4 covers the Compromise of 1850. There were conflicting positions over slavery in America during this time period. The Free Soil Party was formed of Northern Democrats and Whigs who opposed the expansion of slavery, but didn't have an issue with it staying in the South. They wanted westward land to remain only for whites. Most Southerners viewed free soilers and abolitionists as a threat to their way of life. However, others were more moderate and agreed partially with the compromises. In the election of 1848, the Democrats nominated Cass, and the Whigs nominated Zachary Taylor. The Free Soil Party also nominates Van Buren, but Taylor narrowly wins. After the gold rush, California wrote a constitution that banned slavery. Zachary Taylor willingly annexed California and New Mexico as free states, but radicals in the South resented this. Thus, Henry Clay proposes yet another compromise, the Compromise of 1850. The first compromise was to admit California as a free state. The North supported it as it tipped balance towards the North. The South resented it because it unfairly tipped balance towards the northern free states. The second compromise allowed the New Mexico and Utah territories to decide on slavery through popular sovereignty, or a vote. The North resented it because if both territories voted slavery, it would negate the Missouri Compromise. The South resented it because it posed the possibility of both states choosing to be free states. The third compromise was to assume Texas's $10 million debt. The fourth compromise was to ban the slave trade in D.C., but to allow existing slavery to continue. The North resented it because it didn't firmly abolish slavery, and the South resented it because it didn't firmly unabolish slavery. The fifth and the last compromise was to adopt and strictly enforce the fugitive slave law. The North deeply resented this because it legally made slavery allowed virtually anywhere in the United States and forced freedmen back into slavery as well. The South approved of it strongly because runaway slaves were leading Southern slave owners into debt. Taylor disapproves of the law, but his sudden death and Millard Fillmore's ascent to the presidency allowed him to sign the law into effect. 5.5 covers sectional conflict and regional differences. Two groups of immigrants arrived to the United States. The Irish were mostly tenant farmers who came after the Irish potato famine and were targets of nativists because of their Roman Catholic faith and consumption of whiskey. They were equal to African Americans and contributed to local politics, and most of them joined the Democrats. The Germans arrived after failed revolutions in Germany and brought considerable farmers and artisans. They moved westward for cheap land, supported education, abolitionists, and formed close knit communities. Native born Americans feared that these immigrants would take their jobs and intrude in the Anglo majority and resented the Roman Catholic increase. They formed the Know Nothing Party, which required a 21-year wait before attaining citizenship and only allowed native born Americans to hold office. It initially gained strength but soon faded in importance as slavery became the topic of the day. American Indians and Mexican Americans faced religious discrimination for being Roman Catholic as well. There was much agitation over slavery as well. The Fugitive Slave Law helped owners track down runaway slaves who became freedmen in the North, capture them, and return them to their Southern owners. Anyone who attempted to hide a runaway was also subject to punishment. Abolitionists, however, tried to protect African Americans from slavery. The Underground Railroad was a network of activists who helped slaves escape to the North or to Canada, and were mostly freed African Americans like Harriet Tubman. Uncle Tom's Cabin portrayed the harsh treatment of slaves by their owners and portrayed Southern slave owners as inhumane and cruel and was resented in the South. 5.6 covers failure of compromise. In the election of 1852, the Whigs nominated General Winfield Scott and attempted to ignore the slavery issue completely, but pro and anti slavery Whigs quarreled and threatened the unity of the party. The Democrats, however, nominate Franklin Pierce, who supported the Fugitive Slave Law, and Pierce won in the election. Stephen Arnold Douglas soon proposed the Kansas Nebraska Act. It stated that it would divide Nebraska into territories, Kansas and Nebraska, and allow popular sovereignty or a vote to decide if they would be slave states or free states. It was resented by the North because it effectively made way for slavery to expand above 3630, repealing the Missouri Compromise. However, the bill was signed by Pierce and passed in Congress. What soon ensued was an event called Bleeding Kansas. Border conflict between pro slavery and anti slavery groups in Kansas led to a violent back and forth conflict and the establishment of two legislatures in Kansas. The Democratic Party became more divided between the North and the South. The Whig Party soon dismantled due to inner conflict, and ex Whigs scattered to the Know Nothing Party or the Democratic Party. However, ex Whigs who opposed slavery expansion formed the Republican Party, which was composed of Free Soilers and anti slavery Whigs and some Democrats. It was a strictly Northern or sectional party that directly threatened the South. In the election of 1856, the Republicans nominated Fremont, the Know Nothings nominated Fillmore, and the Democrats nominated James Buchanan. James Buchanan and the Democrats win the presidency, but his first challenge was to accept or reject the pro slavery Constitution of Kansas. He asked Congress to accept the document and admit Kansas as a slave state, but Congress disagreed. The next year, the pro slavery document was rejected by Kansas settlers because most people were anti slavery Republicans. The Dred Scott v. Sanford case of 1857 is perhaps one of the most important court cases in American history. Dred Scott, a slave, was taken to free Wisconsin, where he lived for 2 years before returning to Missouri. Scott sued for his freedom and argued that he had lived in a free state, Wisconsin, for 2 years. However, the court Justice Taney ruled that slaves were not citizens and therefore couldn't sue in federal court. He also ruled that slaves were property and could be taken anywhere wanted. He also ruled the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional. The decision delighted Southern Democrats and enraged Northern Republicans. Many began to view this as a conspiracy by James Buchanan and Taney. This also led to many Democrats voting Republican in the following election. Stephen Douglas, a Northern Democrat, and Abraham Lincoln, a Southern Republican, debated over the morality of slavery. Douglas championed popular sovereignty, and Lincoln argued that slavery was a moral issue. He was a free soiler, though, and not an abolitionist. In the Freeport Doctrine, Douglas responded that slavery couldn't exist somewhere if slave codes weren't passed to regulate it, which angered Southern Democrats because he wasn't completely pro slavery. Douglas soon lost support from Southern Democrats, who were extremists, but Lincoln gained ground as a national figure and leading contender for the Republican presidential nominee. 5.7 covers the election of 1860 and secession. John Brown, a Northern abolitionist, and his supporters attacked Harper's Ferry in the South, hoping to spur a slave rebellion. Brown was arrested and executed for treason. The abolitionists saw him as a martyr. The moderates condemned his violence, and the Southerners saw this as proof of the North's intentions of using violence to destroy the South. In the election of 1860, Northern Democrats nominated Douglas, Southern Democrats nominated Breckinridge, Republicans nominated Lincoln, and the Constitutional Union Party, which were composed of ex-Whigs and Know-Nothings, nominated Bell. Republicans hoped to win an easy victory over the divided Democrats. Lincoln's position also appealed to most people in the North, but the South threatened to secede if Lincoln was elected. Lincoln was a minority president, less than half of the popular vote went towards him, but populous free states had enough electoral votes to win Lincoln without a single Southern vote. South Carolina secedes first over wanting to protect slavery, and soon the Deep South states secede. The 7 Deep South states formed the Confederate States of America and elect Jefferson Davis as president. James Buchanan, a lame duck president, didn't try to prevent secession. His Senator Crittenden proposed an amendment that tried to win over the Deep South, which guaranteed the right to hold slaves south of the 3630 line, but Lincoln rejected it because it violated the Republican position. America was now a nation divided. First, at Fort Sumter was cut off by Southern control. Lincoln then sent food to the small federal garrison and gave South Carolina the choice to open the fort or to open fire. South Carolina began firing and captured it in just 2 days. 4 states of the Upper South soon secede: Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, and the Confederates moved their capital to Richmond, Virginia. 4 slaveholding border states remained in the Union: Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky, due to pro Union sentiment and riots between pro and anti slavery fighters. Lincoln fought to keep these border states in the Union because their loss would increase the Southern population by 50%. 5.8 covers military conflict in the Civil War. It's important to notice the differences between the North and the South. When it came to warfare, the Union fought an offensive war because they had to conquer the entire South. The Confederacy fought a defensive war because they only had to defend their land. In terms of population, the Union had 22 million people, including immigrants and emancipated slaves, but the Confederacy fell short at just 5.5 million. The Union had low morale because they were fighting to bring back just a part of their Union, but the Confederacy had a high morale because they were fighting to defend their land from the tyrannical North. When it came to waterways, the North, or the Union, retained the U.S. Navy. The Confederacy, however, controlled the long coastline that was difficult to blockade. The Union had amateur military leaders, but the Confederacy had experienced military leaders, for example, Robert E. Lee. The Union further dominated the U.S. economy. They dominated 85% of factories, 70% of railroads, and were self sufficient. However, the Confederacy only dominated in cotton production, which wasn't useful for an armed war. A shortage of money made them rely on the outside for help, and the Confederate dollar was nearly worthless. In the North, the government was already strong, established, and was central in Washington, D.C. But in the South, or the Confederacy, the government was fairly new, divided, and amateur. Most people believed the war would only last a few weeks. The Union strategy under General Winfield Scott was to blockade southern ports, which was named the Anaconda Plan, control the Mississippi River from around, and divide the Confederacy, and to train an army to conquer Richmond, ending the war. After the Union's defeat at the Battle of Bull Run, their army experienced a string of defeats. General Robert E. Lee of the Confederacy defeated these Union forces in both battles. McClellan, the new Union general, knew Lee's plan to get into Maryland. The Union army then intercepted the Confederates at Antietam, and Lee's army retreated to Virginia, unable to impress Britain or France for monetary support. Lincoln appointed a more aggressive general who attacked Lee's army at Fredericksburg and suffered immense losses. There was no prospect of victory for either side at this point. The Confederate ship Merrimac attacked and sank several Union ships, and the Union ship Monitor fought a 5-hour duel with the Merrimac until it was a draw. Ulysses S. Grant gave the Union stunning victories by capturing 2 forts. He opened Mississippi to Union attack as well, and later the Union Army forced Confederates to retreat at Shiloh. They soon captured New Orleans as well. In the Trent affair, Confederate diplomats traveled to Britain on British steamer Trent, but the Union warship captured these diplomats as prisoners of war. Britain soon threatened war if they weren't released, and Lincoln released the diplomats. The British allowed Confederate Army to purchase its ships, which caused great damage to Union ships. Britain paid the United States money for the damages soon after the Civil War ended. Eventually, Confederate hopes for European support diminished because Britain had other sources of cotton. Robert Lee never had a decisive victory, and majority of Britain was anti-slavery. The Union forces soon triumphed between 1863 and 1865, which was the end of the Civil War. First was the Battle of Vicksburg. In the west, Ulysses S. Grant and the Union artillery bombarded Vicksburg for 7 weeks before the Confederates surrendered the city and its soldiers. The Union now controlled the Mississippi River, which officially split the Confederacy in two. At the Battle of Gettysburg in the east, Lee's army was surprised by Union units at Gettysburg, which was unsuccessful, and Lee's forces had to retreat. In Sherman's march to the sea, William Tecumseh Sherman led a force of 100,000 men and set out from Chattanooga on a campaign of destruction. His troops destroyed everything in the South, set fire to Columbia, and broke the spirit of the Confederacy. Hunger spread through most of the Confederacy soon after, and Ulysses S. Grant outnumbered Lee's forces until the fall of Richmond in 1865. The Confederate government tried to negotiate for peace, but Lincoln wanted complete restoration of the Union. While Lee was trying to escape through the mountains, Grant intercepted. Although Lincoln spoke out against slavery, he hesitated to take action against it, as he wished to keep the border states and protect the constitutional right to keep property and racism in the North. The Confiscation Acts gave the Union Army the power to seize enemy property that were used to wage war against the United States. It also allowed slaves used for rebellion against the U.S. to be freed. Initially, Lincoln was hesitant to ban slavery due to support from pro slavery Unionists, but after the Confederates retreated at Antietam, he warned them that all slaves in rebellion states, which was only the Confederacy, would be emancipated. The Emancipation Proclamation was issued on January 1st, 1863, and freed all slaves in the Confederacy, which only freed about 1% of slaves in the United States. Slavery in the Confederate States and border states continued, but now Union armies were openly fighting against slavery, not just secession. The Union armies had the support of almost 200,000 slaves, formed all black units, and were well respected by whites for their bravery. For example, the Massachusetts 54th Regiment. The Republican majority in the Union was held after secession. Four distinct factions of Northerners were radical Republicans who wanted to abolish slavery, Free Soilers who wanted economic opportunities for whites, but most Democrats criticized Lincoln for how he managed the war. Peace Democrats, or Copperheads, just wanted peace and didn't want to fight the Civil War. Lincoln suspended habeas corpus in states with strong pro-Confederate sentiments, which meant that people could be arrested without a trial. But the Union and the Confederacy made all men aged 20 to 45 liable for military service, but you could exempt if you had a replacement or by paying an exemption fee. This was resented by poor immigrants who thought that it had become the rich man's war but the poor man's fight. In the election of 1864, the Democrats nominated McClellan, who advocated for peace, and the Republicans, renamed the Unionist Party, re-nominated Abraham Lincoln, and Lincoln this time won more electoral votes. After the Civil War, few people doubted the supremacy of the federal government, and Lincoln's Gettysburg Address inspired democracy around the world. Congress raised tariffs, added taxes, and instituted the first income tax to gain funds lost to the war. The U.S. Treasury issued greenbacks or paper currency and created a national banking system in 1863, 2 years before the end of the Civil War. The war accelerated the Northern industrial economy and produced a new class of millionaires who would finance the North's industrialization. The majority Republicans in Congress passed the Pro Business Wage Program. The Morrill Tariff Act raised tariffs to protect American businesses. The Homestead Act promoted settlement of the Great Plains and helped whites. And the Morrill Land Grant Act encouraged states to use federal land grants to maintain colleges. The Pacific Railway Act authorized the building of a transcontinental railroad to connect the Northeast to the Western economies. Pro-Confederate John Wilkes Booth of the South shot and killed President Lincoln at Ford's Theater, which stirred up fury amongst Northerners. 5.10 covers Reconstruction. Slavery gradually crumbled as African Americans escaped to the Union. Northern Republicans wanted to continue economic progress, but Southern aristocrats still wanted low-cost labor to work their plantations. Little help was given to the South, as Lincoln had viewed the Confederates as a disloyal minority. Reconstruction would only happen in the South if they agreed to the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction, which meant they had to take an oath of allegiance to the Union, emancipate slaves, and at least 10% of voters had to take the loyalty oath. In the Wade Davis bill, Republicans in Congress contradicted this 10% plan, but required 50% of voters to take the loyalty oath. It only allowed non Confederates to vote for a new constitution, but Lincoln's pocket vetoed the bill. The Freedmen's Bureau was a welfare agency that provided food, shelter, and medicine to Americans devastated after the war. Andrew Johnson, the next president, championed poor whites, but was the wrong man for pro Union America, as he was a white supremacist. He was initially welcomed by the Republicans, but his pardons to ex Confederates led him to be noted as disloyal by Republicans. Johnson also vetoed a bill that nullified the Black Codes and granted African Americans equal rights and citizenship. Republicans were divided into two sides: the moderates, who favored whites, and radicals, who wanted rights for black citizens. Most moderates began to join radicals because Democrats were becoming more united, and they didn't want to fall too behind. Most radical Republicans endorsed other liberal causes as well. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery in all United States and granted African Americans protection under the Constitution. The Civil Rights Act was when all African Americans were considered U.S. citizens, which nullified the Dred Scott decision. But Republicans feared that the act would be nullified if Democrats came in control and established the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment stated that all people born or naturalized in the U.S. were citizens. All citizens were under equal protection, and disqualified former Confederate leaders from holding office. In the election of 1866, Andrew Johnson set out to deliver speeches that appealed to white prejudice by arguing that equal rights for African Americans would lead to an Africanized society. Republicans counterattacked and inflamed the anger of Northern voters by reminding them of the war and branded Democrats as rebellious. Republicans then gained majority in victory. Congress then passed the Reconstruction Acts of 1867, which divided ex Confederate states into military districts controlled by Union armies and required each state to ratify the 14th Amendment and grant all men the right to vote. Congress passed the Tenure of Office Act, which prohibited the president from removing a federal official without Senate approval because they wanted to protect the radical Republicans. Andrew Johnson challenges the constitutionality of this new law, and the House of Representatives impeached Johnson, but missed doing so by just one vote. In the next election, the Democrats nominated Seymour and the Republicans nominated General Ulysses S. Grant. Grant largely won due to the vote of African Americans. The 15th Amendment gave African Americans the right to vote, and the Civil Rights Act of 1875 guaranteed equal accommodations in public places and prohibited courts from excluding African Americans. The Republican Party dominated Southern governments until conservative Democrats regained control in the state. Whites held majority in the legislature, mostly native white Southerners, freedmen, and New Northerners. Democrats called Southern Republicans scalawags and Northerners carpetbaggers. Northerners arrived in the South as investors, ministers, teachers, or thieves. Ex Confederates deeply resented African Americans in high positions of power. Emancipation meant reunited families for past slaves, but also an increased number of African Americans being literate and migration to freer citizens. Black members left white dominated churches to join African churches, which were established also by many black colleges. Many African Americans chose to migrate to frontier states to establish black communities. During the Ulysses S. Grant administration, corruption and greed increased rapidly in industrial sectors. Spoilsmen began to rise as politicians and practice patronage, which meant giving government jobs to supporters. Corruption by business and political bosses to enrich themselves, giving stock to influential congressmen to cover up their massive profits, defrauding the government, and local political schemes led to Grant's loyalty to dishonest men that tarnished his presidency. Democrats and reform minded Republicans upset with Grant's scandalous presidency elected Horace Greeley. Regular Republicans countered by waving the bloody shirt or reminding people of the Civil War, which led to Grant being reelected. Grant's second term began with a widespread business failure, economic depression, and unemployment. While their husbands were at war, women operated farms and plantations, worked factory jobs, military nurses, and most urban women vacated their jobs when their husbands returned home, but rural women gladly accepted male assistance on the farm. Women, de- Women demanded equal voting rights and opposed the 14th and 15th Amendments because they only included men. 5.11 covers the failure of Reconstruction. In Lincoln's last speech, he encouraged Northerners to accept Louisiana as a reconstructed state and signified that he believed that African Americans should get to vote. Liberalized state constitutions promoted internal improvements, established hospitals, asylums, and home for the disabled, provided school systems The Republicans also took advantage of their power to take bribes and continued business corruption in the North. Radical republicanism diminished as Southern conservatives or redeemers took control of state governments over time, who agreed on states' rights, low taxes, and white supremacy. During the radical republicanism period before, whites organized secret societies to intimidate African Americans, such as the Ku Klux Klan, which was founded by ex Confederate and burned black owned businesses, murdered freedmen to terrorize them, but Congress passed the Force Acts to counter this. Ex Confederate states ratified the 13th Amendment but didn't extend voting rights to black citizens, and former leaders won seats in Congress. Black codes were codes in southern states that stated that African Americans couldn't rent or borrow land, testify against whites, and had to sign work agreements. The South's economy had become dependent on cheap labor. They tried to force freed African Americans to sign a work contract for life, which was basically like slavery, and began a new system called sharecropping. Sharecropping was when the landlord provided the seed and the farm supplies in exchange for half the harvest. They also depended on landowners and evolved into a new form of servitude. In 1872, Congress removed most restrictions on ex Confederates and allowed Southern conservatives to vote Democrat and retake control of governments. In the election of 1876, the Democrats had finally returned to power in most Southern states and nominated Samuel Tilden. The Republicans nominated Rutherford B. Hayes, and the Democrats won the popular vote. However, Hayes won in a special electoral commission, which angered the Democrats. In the Compromise of 1877, the Democrats stated that they would only allow Hayes, the Republican winner for the presidency, to become president if he ended federal support for Southern Republicans and supported building a Southern Transcontinental Railroad. Hayes then fulfilled both promises immediately and withdrew federal troops from the South. Reconstruction soon ended as the Supreme Court removed many laws that once protected blacks. The Southerners called for a new South based on industry, but they had fallen far behind the Northern United States.